Okay, so why don't we at least, I'd like to call to order the special city council meeting of January 8th, 2024, and begin with the Pledge of Allegiance.
Okay, we're not broadcasting the sound through the room. I don't think it's Andrew. I think it's the mics in here.
Oh,
Andrew,
this isn't, mine's on.
Yeah, I hear Helen.
Andrew, can you hear us?
Do you hear us? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So it's fine for right now, but
Do you want me to say that again, or are we on? Okay, so first item is Pledge of Allegiance. Megan, you want to do that?
Yeah. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, second item is instructions on exiting the building in case of an emergency.
great. Thank you for those who are joining us in the room. If you're joining us in the room, if there's an emergency, you can go out the left or right of the rear of the auditorium and then turn left or right to get outside. If you're joining us remotely, if you would like to talk on any item on our agenda, please turn your camera on, or you can indicate in the chat that you'd like to talk, and I'll have the chair call on you. Other than that, we are not monitoring the chat for content.
Trustee.
Item 3, agenda review. Are there any additions, deletions, or changes in order of agenda items? Seeing none, we'll move on to comments and questions from the public not related to the agenda. I don't see anyone in the audience, physical audience. Anyone online? Okay. Item 5, councilors' announcements and reports on committee assignments and the city manager's report.
The wrong agenda.
Do you want to start, Larry?
Thank you. I was looking at the. So, there we are. Get this one closer. So, since our last meeting, I did attend the Natural Resources and Conservation Committee meeting, and good long agenda, including some discussion about still needing staff input on the committee's responsibility for the open space plan. That's still under discussion. We did Dave Wheeler, our staff liaison, gave us a great review of the Heinsberg Road sewer break as well as the water issue. He was up to speed on both of those. So it's good to have a city staff liaison who's really in the know of those in-depth issues. And just before our meeting, the Rec and Park Committee is meeting, and was able to hear a presentation by Joe Larkin and his landscape architects, Wagner Hodgson, on a proposed park area as part of the master plan on Shelburne Road. It's very interesting.
Oh, cool. Where will that be?
Good question.
Oh, you don't know. They're just talking about the concept?
It's part of the master plan of various lots that are on the west side of the railroad tracks, and it's a parcel that's been at this point identified as with a number of stormwater areas on it that would create a 3.5 acre park. And it's probably on the southern end of the, as far as I could tell, it's looked to be on the southern end of the property.
Cool. It's kind of behind Palace 9.
Or behind it or beside it. I couldn't quite tell.
I would have said both. Paul says both.
But they presented to that committee as just to get some ideas.
Great. Thank you. Megan?
No announcements.
Okay. Tim?
Nothing as well.
All right. How about Andrew? Hey, Andrew. No?
It says his audio's not connected.
Okay. You want to send him a message? Thank you. We can come back to him. I just had one meeting, the city school leadership meeting, and as a result of that, we had an additional item added to tonight's agenda. So I think that will be pretty self-explanatory what we talked about, and we'll move on from there. Do you want to do your report?
Yes.
Jesse? Sorry.
So just a few quick things. Sorry, this is a little distracting, this noise thing. Andrew, that looks better. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, we can now.
Yay, thank you.
So do you have any reports from any meetings you went to?
Not since last session. No, thank you, Helen.
Okay, and a ski report? How's the snow? It was good?
We've had quite an adventure.
Good. The wine report in the back, right?
All right.
Okay.
A few quick updates from me. So first of all, we had, this is just a fun update, we had a fantastic first outing of the South Burlington Running Club at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning. This is a brainchild of our new Parks and Recreation Director, Adam Math. So he is doing this every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. at Vet Park. For the inaugural one, we had 12 folks that showed up to run with him. I think the really special thing about that is that only 2 of them came together and knew each other. So there were 10 individuals who showed up to get exercise and connect to one another, and just huge kudos to Adam for that idea and implementing it, and invite all runners of all ability levels out at 8 a.m. every Saturday morning. It was a cold, windy day, and still they showed up. It was great.
Runners are runners.
Runners are runners. I sent around to the council just a few minutes ago a recording of Live at 525, which is a town meeting TV show with Austin Davis from Lake Champlain Chamber and Chief Burke. Chief Burke does a really wonderful job in that presentation, telling the story of kind of the collision of the housing crisis, the mental health crisis, and the public safety crisis. It's about half an hour. I'd really encourage you all to read it. It's really accessible. He does a really good job. He also testified on the retail theft bill in House Judiciary on Friday.
Is that link on the city website for the public to?
So the Live at 525 we will be sending out as part of City News this week.
Oh, good.
And
Okay.
the link to the House Judiciary is on their website.
Okay. Great.
And then just a heads up for your calendars, our delegation is planning a public safety legislative forum on February 15th. So it's still about a month away. That'll be 5:30 in the library. That's all I have.
Okay. Thank you. Moving on to the consent agenda, we have one item, disbursements. Is there any discussion or
I'll move to approve.
Second?
any discussion? Questions? Okay. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
So the
Aye.
consent agenda was approved unanimously. What time is it? Is it time for?
Early.
Oh, it's
We-
early.
We did warn this for 6:30
30,
because
so-
we thought this meeting would go quickly. So you can start the public hearing if you would like.
Okay. Can I have a motion to hold a public hearing on the city plan 2024
So moved.
in a second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
So we are
Aye.
opening the public hearing. Do you have any preliminary comments, Paul? Connor?
Not really, except to say this is a continuation of the public hearing that you started last week. So this is technically still your second public hearing overall. You did receive a few additional comments in the last couple of days. This is the opportunity for the public to weigh in, and then after you close the public hearing, you can decide what you want to do next.
Okay. So are there thoughts about, we did get an email with some additional wordsmithing.
Do you want to go to public hearing first?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. In the public, is there anyone in the public who would wish to comment on the city plan 2024? Okay. So Dan, come up to the mic, make sure the little green dot is bright green.
This is a printed copy of my comments.
Oh, thank you.
Submitted on form. Thanks. For the record, Dan Albrecht, 51 Proctor Avenue. That's the little road that goes to Rice. So a couple of things. Just thanks a lot to the Planning Commission for all their work, to the city staff, and it's a really. It's not just because it has a lot of words. It's a very well researched document, and there's a lot of richness to it. It's nice to see that when you do a rewrite like that, that you have a really good thick description of each of the neighborhoods and stuff. I really like that, because it helps build for the future. And if you were a newcomer, you'd read it like it's like a little mini history, and which is nice because Burlington gets a lot of attention, or the state of Vermont as a whole, and heck, we're over 20,000 people, so we need this kind of history documented. So perhaps the staff will get a citation in some academic work someday in the future and stuff. So, and I was also very pleased to say I had very minor wordsmithing comments and little tweaks here that I had made back in the August one. And as I was working on my testimony for today, and I was kind of going through it, I was like, oh, look, they accepted that word or that word. So I really appreciate that. It feels nice to have that input there. So first is just a broader comment. I know you've heard from others about this, but I'll just sort of state it on the record, just, speak my piece. I disagree strongly with putting climate resilient as the primary overriding objective of the plan. I disagree for the following reasons. First and foremost, placing climate resilient really, at least for me as somebody who participated in the process of the engagement meetings or outreach meetings, whatever those were called, it really sort of directly contradicted the process that we as members of the public were involved in at the time. It was always sort of presented as there's these four themes, four value statements. There was never anything like, oh, and we're going to choose one of them that's more important than the other. It was, sort of like a package. We're like, oh, okay, this kind of makes sense. We see how they wanted to organize the plan. And it's really frustrating just, so we go through that process and then later on the plan comes out, a more formal, a thicker draft comes out later in the summer, and climate resilient has been placed as paramount, that it can outweigh whenever it wants to any of the other justifications or any of the other themes. And that just seemed really inappropriate, especially when you look at a recap of the 9 meetings where they were, again, there were sort of these informal votes of people in the room, that never came out as a top vote getter. People recognize it's important. I think nobody spoke against it, but it was never to be like, oh, this is what the public wants. But third, it's just really frustrating because, again, we have parts of the plan that are creative and trying to do things that do support climate resilience and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but other elements of the plan, they're directly contradictory to such strategies, and namely to put it down sort of to brass tacks, or the reality on the ground is that so my neighborhood, Shelburne Road corridor, city center, Williston Road corridor, we're dedicated to taking all the growth. We're all primarily where the plan's very clear about that. The city zoning rewrite talks about that. The density bonuses if people were ever to do a transfer of development rights. And yet, which, as a planner, as a professional planner, I understand. And that supports, reduces greenhouse gas emissions and build things, walkable and services located next to people and people located next to services. So you have this whole thing in there about climate resiliency and the city patting itself on the back, and yet the plan excludes or adds elements that are directly contradictory to such strategy, which is namely the selected preservation, continuation of certain areas of the city, namely the southeast quadrant, to remain as single-family, large lot zoning. And this is what's really wild. Despite their proximity to major travel corridors, whether it's Heinsberg Road, Dorset Street, Spear Street, and in major employment centers, Tilly Drive being pretty much like as an example of like new employment, not old employment centers. But if you look at new employment centers that are still being built out and still have plenty to go, and yet that whole area is just left off limits. There's no creativity shown or retrofit. And when I testified at the Planning Commission, they by and large, like, yeah, I won't put words in their mouth, but there's like, yeah, were we zoning those neighborhoods now, that would have never been done. There would have been more integrated small scale commercial next to the neighborhoods, right? That's the whole principle of good planning. So it's just really frustrating to sort of see that theme, and yet whole parts of the city are excluded from having to help out. So it's just, and especially frustrating because there's language in the plan that's discouraging the use of municipal and sewer and water in certain portions of the SEQ, despite the fact that using such infrastructure is the best way to achieve density and mixed-use development, which are the best ways to reduce vehicle traffic and emissions through the city. And so related to that, just again, some minor suggested wordsmithing. There's some parts about, again, talking about conservation areas. And it doesn't mean you're doing whole-scale changes and huge amounts of, adding new zoning districts or significant change, but the language I suggested on the last page of my testimony here about when you have, so it's talking about conservation areas should only allow extremely limited residential development, et cetera. And will not have sewer and water, and connections are not priorities. But the problem when you do this, which I point is, however, the very low residential density in these, quote, conservation areas means fewer people live within walking distance of each other, the schools, and any nearby commercial areas. So I think there's a real opportunity for, you can call it, well, it's not really spot zoning, but it's a tinkering with things so that you can have little pockets of commercial nodes at intersections or in appropriate areas. Rye Village sort of has there's one or two where the new doggy daycare is, and there's a couple of little commercial buildings there. So and I think about all that, that's all so close to employers. It's just a way to just like minor retrofits of neighborhoods and stuff would go a long way. I live within walking distance of Price Chopper and the new bagel place, which is awesome, Myers Bagels and stuff. And I just think we need more of that because we have whole sections of our committee that are nothing but a desert of single family zoning, and there's no commercial, which means every time huge sections of our city have to do anything, they have to get in their car. They can't even just like, oh, I want to go get a bagel. I want to go get a little bit of this or a little bit of that. They've got to get in their car. And that's directly contradictory, ironically, to the primary goal of climate resiliency. So again, I know I'm nitpicking a little bit, but it just stands out as a little bit of inconsistency. That's all. And it would be nice if the city recognized that. It doesn't mean their way of life's going to change. They'll always have open, it's not going to really change things. But I think people in that area of the city would probably like not having to schlep all the way over to Shelburne Road or University Mall or Heinsberg Road to get a few things, or to go to the bank or whatever. Like if we had several more little cider mills or little commercial nodes sprinkled through the city, I think it would that's what makes a vibrant city, as opposed to right now that sort of good section of the city that's a relic of bad planning. So thanks, appreciate it. But again, applaud the staff and the commission for all their work. It's a really great, I won't say it's a novel, but it makes for very informative, because some plans can be kind of lazy. They just do a couple paragraphs, but this is like, ooh, this is really interesting, and you can learn a lot. So I appreciate that. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Are there any other comments from the public? Michael Mittag?
No plaids this week?
I was just going to make a comment, and then I thought, no, Helen, don't do that.
I guess I'd ask a question first, and if I get the right answer, I can go home. Are you still considering changing the wording of this issue that Dan raised about the overriding guiding principle of the plan is to make every policy decision through the lens of climate change, etc.?
personally,
know it was a
I'm not
discussion last week.
interested, but there may be other people and I may be overvoted, so I don't know about the rest of the council.
I have some ideas.
Beg your pardon?
I have some ideas.
Okay,
Um,
so I guess that's still on the table.
all right. Then,
You're going to stay now, right?
beg your pardon?
You're going to stay?
I'm going to stay.
Yeah.
Not
kidding.
long.
Just kidding.
No. First of all, we had a public survey in January 2023, which was very well responded to by the community. We held 9 or 11 facilitated public meetings in February and March, which was the basis for the first draft. And the Planning Commission held 4 public listening sessions in the library at times when people weren't at work, so that people who had jobs could participate. And there were 17 Planning Commission meetings devoted to this plan between February and December. So a lot of time and effort was put into it, and 7 commissioners approved the text which they submitted to you. It's important that statement is important because since modern humans emerged from Africa about 200,000 years ago, humanity has never suffered an existential catastrophe. But as Vince Bolduc said last week, today we do face an unprecedented existential threat. So this statement is in context of the situation which we find ourselves in. Mr. Bolduc also voiced his concern that every policy decision would be made through the lens, but he didn't distinguish between policy decisions and others. He gave a few examples of should the fire department consider this paragraph when deciding to respond to a fire alarm, or the police department when deciding to respond to an emergency. It's a bit of a stretch. Those are not policy decisions. Those are the kind of decisions that the people who work for this city make every day, and probably many times a day. Those are not policy decisions. This is talking about policy, the things that you do. So I'm making a plea for you not to change it for the reasons I've just outlined. And I read off all the work and the public outreach that was done, because you might have got the wrong impression from my friend Mike at the mic that there wasn't any. He said the right people weren't in the room, just the elites. So I'd like to, those points that I made at the outset should put your minds at rest. There was huge public outreach and input. And the public approved at the public hearing, as far as I can tell, approved the draft that we sent you. C'est tout, madame. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Okay. Jessica Luisos, the chair of the Planning Commission. You'd like to make some comments?
Yeah, I guess, I wasn't going to say anything during the public hearing, but I feel like it's important to follow up on what Michael just said. I know he may or may not have been speaking for the whole commission, but I do think most of his points would speak for the whole commission, and specifically to add to them, in July, we put out a full working draft and got significant public input on that working draft. And at that time, we had elevated the climate change goal separate from the other 3. And we did get some feedback that it felt like it would be good to have all 4 of them as equal goals, but with the climate change one having additional language that it's overarching. So, I mean, we did actually get specific public input that kind of drove us to give you the draft that we gave you, because it was advertised in July as an overarching goal. Even though in kind of the winter sessions last winter, all 4 of those goals were given as potential draft goals, without any of them being kind of overarching. So I think it's important to say that we did do a lot of outreach. We did get a lot of feedback on this topic, and did make some changes before it came to you. And it was unanimous the way that we forwarded on to you, with the climate change one being overarching, but listed as 4 bullet points kind of grouped together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other public comment? Yes, Brian. I'm sorry, Ryan. Yeah.
There we go.
Now
Sorry, I have a cold. So I'm just going to stick to the transportation section. Something that I think is noticeably absent from actions is adopting design standards. We have design standards at the state level for autocentric transportation. We don't have those at the state level for pedestrian or bike transportation. And the result is that any design standards that have been created for those are completely elective. And that's why when you get feedback that, you know, parts of Market Street are very unfriendly to people walking or biking, it's because we didn't actually use standards that were meant for people who are walking and biking. I know Tim had the comment a few meetings back about when people were talking about opening their doors along the curve of the road, feeling like cars were going really fast, and saying, didn't we have engineers look at this? We did. They were looking at AASHTO manuals. There are a lot of different manuals that focus on safety for walkers, bikers, wheelchair users. And there's actually a lot of points in the paragraph sections that are really good points that have been worked in here, but there aren't any action points for them. The action point, to sum it up, would be safe design standards for all users. Amsterdam used to be a really dirty, car-laden city at the end of the 60s, and a plan was put forward to do the standard demolition and build highways. But unlike America, the people really fought back on that and decided that they wanted to see road standards that put people first. And they adopted standards, and then whenever they redo a road, they redo the road to the new design standards. That's not something we have here in Vermont, certainly not in South Burlington. And so we just had this project on Dorset Street where we put in new walk signals, for example, and we dug up a lot of sidewalk and we put it back in the same exact way. Rather than having design standards in place that have us put it in a better way that's better for people who are walking and biking. We do use different standards like ProWag, which has to do with sort of the minimum standard for a wheelchair user to get around. And they're pretty detailed. They have a lot of minutia to them. And they were used for that project, but limitedly. So not even every aspect of the project followed ProWag. One of the really important pieces is that we keep safe access around a construction site. Obviously, that's been a big issue for the school district on Market Street, and you guys have had a lot of discussions about that. And there are written documents about how to do this in cities in North America. Many cities have adopted them, but we don't have anything in our language about adopting that for us. We do mention the importance of those things, but there's no action item for it. I have a picture of a guy using a walker walking along Dorset Street near San Remo Drive because replacing the same sidewalk the same exact way left no space for him to get around. He had to go into the street slowly with his walker during morning rush hour. Not a really safe situation, right? And so I would really like to see in Action 79 about adopting design standards that encompass a lot of these points, like the first paragraph in multiple user types. Fantastic paragraph. And what we really need to ensure these things is adopt design standards. Later on, when we talk about, in the second paragraph, including safe passage for pedestrians and bicyclists during construction, modifying and upgrading roadways, that's when we have design standards that say that explicitly, not electively. When we talk in the third paragraph about reducing conflicts with motorized vehicles in places like curb cuts, these are things that we have to have, not as disparate pieces that are elective, but in a full design standard. And even we don't use the word medians in access management. I would encourage adding the word medians somewhere in that paragraph as well. We have some information about medians in existing policies in the city, but again, when we consolidate this into a design standard, all of the engineers that we hire have to use that. The federal government last year passed a law saying that any city can adopt bike ped friendly design standards, even if their state government forbids it. You can assume which states have forbidden it, obviously, and for the reason that the feds have done this. And the feds actually recommend a lot of design standards. We do have snow as an issue here. We have a 10-foot wide shared use path, and a 7-foot wide plows it in the winter. So we have, in the winter, a 7-foot wide shared use path. Cities like Ottawa and Montreal, in their design standards, they also have the explanation of how they remove snow. So in Ottawa, they built this beautiful standard for Dutch-style intersections, which are incredibly safe for bikers and pedestrians. Ottawa is rapidly implementing these, and that standard includes the snow removal process right in the design standard. These things are really important for doing something effectively and correctly the first time, rather than us just trying to always catch up, but still being behind the 8 ball. So that's something that I would recommend. I won't go into the minutia of other little things that seem kind of off, except mentioning the weird paragraph where it talks about possibly making Williston Road 2 lanes. The last traffic count was 28,000 vehicles per day between Dorset and Heinsberg Road along Williston Road. When you look at good downtowns in Vermont, Montpelier, St. Albans, Main Street, Burlington, they all have less than 11,000 vehicles per day. Even Burlington on Main Street west of South Winooski Avenue. And so if you're looking at reducing traffic by 17,000 vehicles per day, nothing else in this plan identifies how you're going to get there. There's no other bypass without choking off the airport and all of the businesses heading towards Williston. So I really want you guys to think about the realism of Williston Road ever being part of a proper downtown rather than a good access point to better walkable places on either side of it and having very accessible crossing, but maintaining good throughput. Jeff Speck's Walkable City is a really excellent book that talks about those principles. Chapter 10 is pretty much exactly talking about Williston Road. It's also the shortest chapter, so I would recommend that one for inspiration. Then I'll save the rest of my comments about that. Thank you.
Are there any other comments? Seeing none, I guess we can close the public hearing and have our discussion.
I move that we close the public hearing.
We have a second? All in favor? Aye.
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 Okay, the public hearing is closed. And I guess Counselor Barrett, you had some thoughts?
Yeah, no, sorry, that was squeaky. So, first of all, I mean, Tuesday, right? We were here Tuesday. It's been so long since we were here last time.
Mhm.
And it was good discussion. And Vince Bulldog came up and talked about that paragraph. And I had a gut reaction to it where I thought that I thought was deserved for a response. And maybe I was a little bit too aggressive with that response. And if anybody was, takes exception with it, I apologize for that. But I thought I made a lot of really good points about how the city has been trying hard to basically, put that principle in the back seat for the climate change. And so, in looking at this very short paragraph, my suggestion would just be, and I don't want to, I'm not de-emphasizing anything. I'm just softening it with a little wordsmithing so that it doesn't become redundant. But I would just say the guiding principle of this plan is to make policy decisions through the lens of climate resilience and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, while recognizing other important goals in our diverse communities. So, I mean, it takes the original, but it just gets rid of overriding, and it says it gets rid of the word every policy decision. I mean, obviously, we have that importance that runs throughout the plan. And although I think Vince, exhibit a little hyperbole where the fire department might say, well, we're not going to go out and run the truck out because we don't want to burn any diesel, right? So, but just modifying a little bit to understand that there are some policy decisions that you can't really change for a while until we have that ability. But there are a lot of bigger ones where we can, and the guiding principle for the city plan is to recognize that we have to make these hard choices in the future, right? So how we manage the city, how we manage the things that we burn, that we build, that we buy, that we use, and all those things. So that's just my simple suggestion. The guiding principle of this plan is to make policy decisions through the lens of climate resilience. ...
I would support that. I think that hyperbole is not helpful in a planning document, and I understand the urgency of climate change, believe me, and do not at all question the value of making that the guiding principle. But I don't think that overriding an every is realistic, or it seems too contrary to the public input and to weighing in the various factors that we have to do as city leaders. And I did like Bob Britt's change from recognizing to factoring in, because I think that factoring in means that we are balancing. And what I would suggest, and I suggested this at our retreat for the budget, that we do have public votes, just like we did for the penny on pads, where we have the public actually weigh in. We need to be sure that the public is behind the city policy, just to make sure. And it's going to that means that there are going to be difficult discussions, and that there are going to be honest discussions, just like we're having right now. But I think that rather than causing strong reactions from people, we need to be seeking aggressive, but not overly aggressive, policy direction in face of a crisis, and it is an existential threat. I completely agree, but without creating just the backlash, because that is not helpful. This is we're in a political climate now where we see a lot of flashpoints, and I would really caution people who are leaders in the city, and people who look to the leaders of the city to stay away from the flashpoints, and to really find ways to come together. We all recognize it's a problem, and how can we push in the same direction? I think that's going to be same with schools. We have to push in the same direction, and I'm wholeheartedly going to support your budget proposal because it's good for the city, and we have to do it. And it's hard, but we have to do it, and we have to do it in a way that is not creating, those anger points. So I would support Tim's language, and I also would replace recognizing with factoring in. I
Is
think
that
that
friendly enough?
That's friendly. Do we want to keep principles and goals, or just factoring in other important goals in our diverse community? What do you feel about
principles and goals sounds good to me too.
principles and goals? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I wasn't turned on. So yeah, I can live with that too.
Other comments?
Paul,
I'm sorry.
are you capturing?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Well, let's have the council finish their conversation, Michael, first. Are there any other thoughts or
Yeah, hey,
comments?
hi, Helen. Yeah, I'll comment. So it's
Okay.
interesting when Jessica spoke, she didn't use the word overriding. She used the word overarching. And I do think we don't mean that climate will override everything else. I do think we mean it's really important, but not that it overrides everything else. And so I do understand the objection to the word override because I don't really think that's what we mean. I like that Bob Britt uses thesaurus to come up with the word cardinal, which I thought was really nice. I would suggest adding that in addition to the changes we just discussed. So yeah.
So you're in agreement with the slightly modified language that Tim has suggested?
Yeah, I think the word override is too, I don't really think we mean that. I like Bob's suggestion of replacing that with the word cardinal. But I understand and I do agree that overriding is probably not what we mean.
And then you like factoring in other important principles and
Yeah, the
Okay.
rest of it looked good. Yeah.
All right. Any other thoughts?
On this or on something else?
I think we should take it one at a time. So let's do it on this.
Could Tim repeat that, your sentence?
Do you want to read it again?
Repeat that sentence again.
Using cardinal?
So I don't agree with using cardinal.
Oh, okay.
Right. Mine was just the guiding principle of this plan is to make every policy decision through the lens of climate resilience and reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, while then taking Bob Britt's factoring in other important principles and goals in our diverse community.
And you changed every policy decision to policy decisions.
To make policy decisions. I'm sorry, did I read it incorrectly just now? I think I did. Yeah. So the guiding principle of this plan is to make policy decisions through the lens.
Okay. So you wanted, so that's on the table, I guess, if that's, is there a second to that or do we need to,
I'll second that.
and so it doesn't use the word cardinal?
Right.
Okay. Is there further discussion? Yes.
Paul Connor, Director of Planning and Zoning. My only suggestion, if you choose to go in that direction, up on the screen there you see the next section where there's a section heading called Guiding Principles. I would suggest that you then change that to Principles, because based on Councillor Baird's description, the guiding principle of the plan is to make policy decisions. You can't have one and then four. So I would suggest saying, if you say the guiding principle is climate, then I would call the others principles.
Are we talking about the same sentence though,
He's
right?
talking about the heading.
The heading
The
under,
orange guiding principles heading.
Okay.
That you would just adjust that orange guiding principles just to principles.
Oh,
right. And the
list out.
sentence above it, South Burlington holds high the following principles. Because if you're going to relate the discussion to being a singular guiding principle, then it should be singular versus
Okay. I agree with that.
okay. Larry, you
Well,
look puzzled.
Well, that wasn't, I mean, the original text says the overriding guiding principle and then continues, and then we still have this heading guiding principles. I'd hate to have us reduce the other three principles in the context of whether we're using the word overriding or not.
Right. So is cardinal then perhaps attractive
I
for
happen
that
to like the
reason?
word cardinal, but I understand there's some reasons not to like that. But, yeah, so I think there's some.
Do you want to say main principles?
The what? I'm sorry.
Main?
Main
Main.
principles?
Main principles.
Guiding principle.
I'm going to look that up.
Principal
I
principles?
think Paul's suggestion is a good one. If we have one guiding principle, the others are principles, and it keeps everything in the same. Really, as it was, we had one overriding guiding principle. It seems to me Paul's suggestion makes us read cohesively.
I like guiding though. I do agree with Larry.
In orange.
Yes, I do. So I go back to Jessica's use of overarching, if you don't like cardinal, where it is all embracing and is forming an arch over something.
How about
Does
key?
not override.
Key principles?
Key
Key.
principles.
Key.
Okay.
So the
the
orange
heading.
would read key principles.
Key principles.
Does
Uh,
that work for you,
Tim,
Paul?
just to clarify, are you describing the sentence that you were using to add the word key, or the
No.
header
The
to
header.
say
The
key
orange
principles instead of guiding
or
principles?
yellow?
The orange.
Got
The
it.
orange.
Okay.
There's main. We could use main guiding principle.
I suggested that, but I think key is more exact, precise, astute.
Well, and it gives equal importance to all four.
Mm-hmm.
But then we
So
say
is this? I'm sorry. Is the suggestion now to say in the climate sentence the key guiding principle of this plan is to etc. and keep everything a guiding principle? Is that what we're saying?
no. I think what we're suggesting is in the orange where it says guiding principles and then it identifies the four principles. We would change that to key principles, but then in the sentence, I don't know if we're going to embrace cardinal, but the guiding principle of the plan is to make every policy, to make all policy, no, every policy decisions, to make, take out every, to make policy decisions through the lens of climate resilience and reduction in greenhouse gases while factoring in other important principles and goals in our diverse community.
That's a bit weak. Key and guiding are kind of synonymous.
Okay.
Yeah, but then we're not using the same word. So there's I don't know. We can embrace another group that says, oh yeah, okay, guiding or key. So is that amenable to everyone? Are you still stuck on cardinal, or is it okay to just say the guiding principle of this plan?
I'm fine with them. Yeah.
Okay.
I would add the main guiding principle, something to it, because guiding and key are very synonymous, and it really, I think, then changes the intent of this.
No, guiding is different. Guiding to me is the direction you're moving in. Key means it's important.
Michael, do you want to say something? Yes.
I speak for myself, not for my co-commissioners, but I think what Tim proposed and the addition of Bob Britt's wording certainly acceptable to me. I can live with that. And I'd like to remind you, this is not a literary document. This is a guidance document, policy guidance document. So whether we use the word key or guiding in one place or another, just pick one.
Yeah, we're probably
But I
reading
think
into
you've come up
much of
with a
this.
good solution. Tim.
So where are we? Yep, I think we are.
You have a motion and a second.
We have a motion and a second.
Did we decide on key?
I think we did decide on key
So
principles.
orange, key principles, and otherwise the guiding principle of this plan is to make policy decisions through the lens, blah, 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 factoring in other important principles and goals, which are Bob Britt's, right?
Right. We're not using
Have we
overriding
captured that?
or cardinal.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's written down? Okay.
Do you want me to share it so you can look at it?
Nah.
I haven't.
Okay, are you ready to vote on that?
On just that one thing?
Just that one thing? Okay, all in favor? Is this going to be unanimous? If not, I need to do a roll call.
Sure, Helen.
Okay, it's unanimous. All right. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Thank you.
Thank you. See what a
Well played. On the
good
open
day
meeting
on the
law.
slopes does to.
Worn down.
He's worn down,
Just
right?
worn down.
Okay. Now there's some other issues people had.
I just wanted to bring forward a resident's concern regarding the airport and the language with regard to emissions. It's on page 30 of the plan. His concern, this is just above the buildings and thermal energy sector subsection. The second to last paragraph begins emissions generated by Leahy International Airport. And he suggested that we add after emissions other than from aircraft. And reading through that passage, as I let this resident know, one, that I would share his concerns since he couldn't be present, but two, that I did not find the language misleading. I thought that it was a fair statement without implying anything more. And I was glad then to also hear from Andrew, who was one of the writers of our climate action plan, and you can certainly explain, Andrew, better than I can, that he said when climate plans talk about emissions, scope 3 emissions, and you can tell me what scope 3 emissions are almost always excluded. Emissions from planes are scope 3. So he agrees with me that the language isn't misleading, but I still wanted the concern of the resident to be brought forward, just so that it was heard.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. Yeah, just to maybe 30 seconds of explanation, right? Scope 3 emissions are kind of the indirect emissions that the relevant organization can't control. So emissions from planes are kind of the domain of Delta or United or the military and not the airport. And very, very few climate plans, including ours, address scope 3 emissions. So I think this is written consistent with how climate plans are generally perceived and written.
Thank you, Andrew.
All right. Any other thoughts on this plan?
So I wanted to just ask the others about Ryan's comments about in the transportation. I don't know the plan well enough to be able to respond. But it reminds me of last week's meeting when Michael Mittag mentioned the growth management plan. I mean, I think that this is a high level planning tool that further plans take direction from. So would a transportation design plan is there enough room in our transportation area to have that as a goal? And I'm just asking that because I want to make sure his points were addressed.
Yeah.
I don't know if there is room. I don't know what that would entail. Actually, my understanding is that there's quite a few different standards for roads and sidewalks, and as a single community, I guess you pick one or two. Maybe we can debate over whether the city of South Burlington has picked the correct ones. I'm not sure this plan is the place to do that. And I guess I would, after you make comments, Tim, I guess I would defer to,
Can I comment?
oh, yeah, okay, to anyone from the administration about sort of what do we use and how into the weeds should we get? So did you want to make a comment?
So a couple of comments. I know there's a philosophical difference of opinion between the MUTCD standards and the ASTO standards between city staff and Mr. Doyle. We do absolutely follow those. We also have public works standards that our team is working to develop that are referenced in the LDRs. So I think this is something we are actively working on, and you can put it as a policy charge in your plan if you would like, but it's something that we are doing anyway. It's been in your policies and procedures priorities. So I think it's covered, but if you want to reflect that in your plan, you certainly can.
Oh, that's good
So
to hear.
I think it's important to understand that the LDRs control a large swath of that, right? And if it's being worked on, that's great. I know that, there's already form-based codes. There are other standards as well. And, when applications go through the DRB, I mean, they're spelled out by planning and zoning in those applications. So I don't think I want to get too detailed in that type of stuff in this document, right? Because this is more of it's a higher level aspirational document. And there is work going on Williston Road to add in some bike paths, and there is work on the intersections. There is work on the crosswalks. That's planned. It's going to happen.
No, there are medians. They've added medians.
So anyway.
Does that,
So that helps me understand that there's room underneath the city plan for this to continue. That's fine. I'm just not familiar with the various standards that either city manager mentioned or Ryan mentioned. I think that, and those shouldn't be part of the plan. Those should be internal discussions further. Right.
well, someday you can volunteer for the DRB and learn all about them.
I could do that. Thank you. Yes. I have been there once.
Ryan?
Can you come to the mic so the folks online can hear you? Please. Thank you.
So when Jesse says that Public Works has some level of planning around this, it's really not what I'm talking about for a level of design. You guys could look these up. NACTO has, NACTO, National Association of City Transportation Officials, has some really great plans. They're not the only ones, but they are some of the FHWA approved plans that cities can adopt even if their states don't allow them to. And anything we're doing at the city level comes nowhere close to that. So I want to emphasize the difference between designating space for bikers, pedestrians, and people with mobility issues versus designing space. So you can say that we're going to put a crosswalk here or a sidewalk, but that doesn't mean it's actually designed for really good or high volume usage by people on bike or foot. And that's the kind of issue we come up against. So people say, well, look, we painted bike lanes here, but the type of bike lane you create depends on the volume of traffic, the speed of traffic, the number of accidents that occur. You're supposed to design it based on factors that are present on the ground rather than just designating space. Those are two very different things. And so municipalities that successfully move toward increasing bike transportation, like Montreal, for example, on the plateau now, they're getting 22% of people commute by bike to work. It's phenomenal, right? And they've done this by developing infrastructure that makes it safe, comfortable, and convenient to do so. Simply putting a multi-use path in a place that is too dense for a multi-use path doesn't actually do that. It designates space, but it doesn't design space. And so an action item is as simple as saying, developing and adopting design standards that focus not on, or that focus specifically on bike, ped, and alternative mobility or disabled disability users. Whereas right now, we don't do that. And I can say for certain that our city does not even optionally choose to follow them when we have the opportunity to. I'll go back to ProAg. ProAg has all sorts of things laid out, and the city only used the small section of ProAg that talks about the placement of the poles for pedestrian buttons. It didn't use any of the other information about even the tactile strips and how you're supposed to lay those out at the edge, or how far apart they're supposed to be from other things, or the cross slope on sidewalks, which is probably a term you guys don't think about. But all of those design standards exist in the world in North American cities, and we don't use them here. And if we want to get to where Andrew talks about people actually really commuting by bike or getting to the store by bike or on foot, we need to actually have design standards that bring us there so that we know what we're doing when we make these decisions, rather than digging up a sidewalk and redoing it over and over again.
Well, perhaps a good next step would be to really ask the Bike and Ped Committee how deep they have dived into this level of design and influence on the construction of our bike paths. Because, I mean, I don't know. Ryan has made some suggestions that the city hasn't done or looked at X, Y, and Z, and I don't know how he has that information. I don't.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I can act upon it from one person saying it just doesn't happen. But I would certainly be supportive of the Bike and Ped Committee getting a little more familiar with this, because that is probably an equity issue as well.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't specifically. Oh,
No,
who's
go
speaking?
ahead.
We don't specifically have, update design standards, but we do have, and I don't know, this is maybe the paragraph you didn't like, Ryan, I don't know, but we must continue to encourage all types of roadway users, including pedestrians, bicyclists, wheelchair and scooter users, and transit riders. While facilities on or along roadways are needed, the city also needs to add off-street bike and pedestrian paths. So there's nothing about mixed use. It's off-street bike and pedestrian paths, plural. Separated facilities are inclusive for pedestrians and bicyclists of all ages. Now maybe that's what's the mixed use there. And abilities, but also abilities who may be less comfortable using a sidewalk, bike lane, or path adjacent to a road. These routes must be clear and unimpeded, including being well maintained in all seasons. And then it goes on, the city includes safe passage for pedestrians and bicyclists when constructing, modifying, and or upgrading roadways. Clearly, nothing is perfect. The gentleman you saw, I also got an email, and we just need to respond to those needs when we aren't proactively addressing them. So those goals are there in the plan.
Well, this is the paragraph that describes it, but I'm just saying we're lacking the action item that actually pulls those into us making movement on it. Because the bike head master plan won't actually address much of that stuff. It will sort of address network gaps, but it really won't get into the quality design standard.
Well, we can certainly put update design standards. I mean, if that,
I don't think design standards belong in this document, right?
Okay.
I think they belong with the LDRs.
With the
And that's for
LDRs.
planning and zoning to distinguish
Right.
and public works as well, so. But thanks for the input. I mean, it's,
Okay.
This is just saying that you will do it, whereas if you say it's up to the LPRs, that's floating out in space now, as opposed to putting it in this document, saying that an action is to develop it somewhere in the city realm.
Well, I think the work of the planning commission, much of it is from our direction. So you've raised the issue. If that's something we want them to do, that's top of the pile for LDR changes. We can always make that assignment,
yeah.
I think.
There is on page 6, just above the topic sections, subheading, having a city plan enables the city to ... And then zoning regulations govern the details, including setting design review standards. So it is there. It is there. It's just not an action item, but it is.
Okay.
Okay. The only thing that I wanted to, I guess, ask and have confirmed is that although we don't have necessarily the same density for the, certain areas of the city, that infill is included for all areas of the city where there is water and sewer, and I that's how I read the document. So just getting back to Dan's comments, I saw infill for all areas in the city where there is water and sewer. Is that correct?
That's correct. So even in the district that is, or including in the district that is listed as lower scale, principally residential, which is essentially all of our existing neighborhoods, whether they are Mayfair Park or Eastwoods or Butler Farms, in there it discusses infill and it talks about supporting activities and uses like civic spaces and small scale commercial. The only district where that's left out is the principally conservation district, which is largely your natural resource protection district and your habitat blocks, where the housing that is permitted is at a extremely low level of one home per up to 15 acres, and largely conservation being the goal.
Thank you for confirming my understanding, Paul. So
Thank
I
you.
feel comfortable.
Okay.
can I just also comment on Dan's comments?
Yes,
right?
you may.
So, I mean, I
sorry
appreciated
he's not here.
his feedback, but I mean, I got to point out that the Red Barn at the top of Tilly Drive, has milk, and you can buy eggs there and some other things, and it's not a full grocery store, but you can also, it's a full deli, right? And the Hill Farm is going to be built out someday, and that's going to be a perfect customer set, for that small business. It's hard to get some of those small commercial type things in those farther flung, more rural parts of the city, right, where there is less density, right, that can actually make it, right? So, but that's a perfect example of that business being next to Tilly Drive, O'Brien Hillside North,
And on
Rye.
Route
And
116.
it's right on 116. So, I mean, I don't understand some of his comments because that business is filling a niche that is needed, that kind of like the cider mill or the mill market and deli on Dorset Street. So,
And
There's
just,
also a commercial lot in South Village that I understand. There's a lot of focus
That's
to
right.
put kind of similar amenity in.
and just getting back to Linda Bailey's comment from last week, here on page 31 under energy, where it talks about weatherization and electrification, the last sentence of the first full paragraph reads, "The city must design a system that will not cause economic hardship for people without resources to change over, benefit from, and then operate new systems." So I just wanted to underscore that this plan is not insensitive to people's ability to pay, and that was one of her concerns.
But
I received an email following about the.
One of the points we did make when she came up and spoke was that people can still go buy air conditioners in the summer if their houses are hot.
Right.
They don't have to buy a heat pump. But, I mean, an air conditioner is a heat pump, but it's a one-directional heat pump, right? So
Right.
we still have that ability.
Okay, so have we gone through all the different changes? Paul?
I have, if the council, it sounds like you are going to be making a couple of small changes. So I have one additional one to give you. Staff identified a little inconsistency in word usage.
Okay.
So on page 80, we have, which is the future land use 80.
80. Okay, I did hear 80.
The one of the land use categories is called commercial with supporting uses. The map associated with it says commercial/industrial with supporting uses. We'd like to be consistent and use the word commercial/industrial with supporting uses.
Okay.
So just to save a future
that
question
sounds
mark
good.
in 5 years' time.
And Bob Brick caught a few typos. Did you see those? They are map 4, and there should be the I in infrastructure should be capitalized under map 4, and the L in land should be capitalized under map 8. That's in the table of contents, sorry. Do you see his email, Paul?
Yes.
He also said you may want to do a search for the word city with a small c. As for consistency, some need to be changed to city with a capital C.
So, so I agree with, and we're happy to do all of the changes except the one about city, because we did very purposefully city when it's referring to the city of South Burlington as a corporate entity as a capital C, and when it says people who live in the city like to, that's a small c.
Yeah.
Our city planner was very meticulous about that
All
subject.
right. All
So
right.
it's intentional that it's large and small
And then
based
the
on proper
S
pronoun.
at the end of steep on page 35 of the environmental section. And a U is missing in contiguous on the same page. Page 35.
We can make the rest of those changes.
Pardon me?
We can make the rest of those changes
Okay.
with your concurrence.
Steep slopes. Yeah, well, they were thinking of Russia at the time. Oh, well, someone else. Maybe it wasn't changed when he saw it. All right, so can we bundle all of those together?
Mm-hmm.
Would you like a motion?
Yes, I would. And we need to move those changes and then warn a third public hearing for
So,
January 29th.
so I would like to move to make the following changes that we've discussed tonight to the draft city plan as presented and to warn a public hearing on the modified plan for Monday, January 29th at 7 p.m.
I'll second.
Is there any further discussion? Okay, all in favor signify by saying aye.
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 So that carries. Thank you. So we'll be back at it on the 29th.
Good.
All righty.
And remember, that's your second public hearing of that night, because
Right.
you'll have the first one on the charter change.
Even better.
2 public hearings.
Okay, so let's see. We're down, thank you, Paul. We're down to number 9. So don't move. The Vermont Land Trust Bread and Butter Farm Conservation Project at Eau Claire Farm. And we're going to review and approve a non-development agreement and the city right of first refusal for area excluded from conservation on parcel B of the former Eau Claire Farm property, in line with prior city council decision to release pre-approved funds on condition of city council approval of the NDA, which is the non-development agreement, and the RUFFER, which is the city's right of first refusal.
Hi,
So-
folks. Paul Connor, Director of Planning and Zoning. Colin McNeil, City Attorney. So we are getting towards the finish line with this Eau Claire property. The document in front of you has essentially 2 components. If you recall, the Eau Claire Lot B, which is the west side of Heinsberg Road, north of Cheese Factory Road. This is the big property the largest of the properties. This has been the main focus of the city's investment. With that, the city and its partners, the Vermont Land Trust, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and others, are pursuing a permanent third-party conservation through the Natural Resource Conservation Service for about 110, 115 of the acres of the total, leaving approximately 10 at the very northern end to be able to be used for non-conservation purposes. So that's where the work has been going here. The city asked last year, when just about the same time, the city requested that in enumerating all the different ways that the city's investment are being benefiting the community, that for that most northern piece, that there be that the city have a right of first refusal in the instance that it goes to some party that doesn't have the same vision. So that is incorporated in this document, that the city would have a right of first refusal on the northernmost piece. The other piece of this is the owners of the full parcel today are looking to split their ownership for essentially financial purposes. Vermont Land Trust has agreed to carry and own the large parcel that will be permanently conserved, which will save substantial money because it is currently owned by an investment company that collects a return on it each year. Vermont Land Trust did not, however, want to be the owner of the remaining 10-ish acres at the northern end because that's not core to their mission. So we worked closely with them to identify a portion of our land development regulations that allows for just essentially this scenario, where a piece of land can be divided without being officially subdivided through the DRB. So effectively what it means is that functionally, for all planning and zoning purposes, it remains one parcel. No development activity can take place on either portion of it without going to the DRB for a full subdivision review. But in the meantime, they can have two different owners of that land and not have to go through the expense of a whole DRB process to do it. So it is enabling and facilitating the conservation. And that's what's in here. Anything to add to that, Colin? Did I misstate anything?
No, I think, Paul, I think you got it all. I think I would just highlight that as part of this agreement, and Paul did hit on this, that a major component of it is that the Wild Turkey Divide has agreed that this property would not be developed, they've waived their development rights on this property, both the excluded parcel and the conserved parcel, until a subdivision review takes place. And that at this point, the property can only be used for agricultural forestry purposes until that review does take place. So there's two major components to this that this agreement ensures.
Questions? Tim?
Yeah, so I remember the 605 that we allocated and that was spent, right?
We have not dispersed either the 605 or the 300-ish, 304, I think it is.
And the other
It's been
300
pending tonight's action.
the other 309 was that in order to facilitate a USDA grant, if I remember?
It was to take full advantage of a NRCS matching grant of them putting in $910,000 to match the city's $910,000.
And is that still on the table? And
Yes,
active?
that's the purpose. That's one of the purposes of this agreement, is to move into that next step. The anticipated closing is in the next couple of months, if not sooner.
I didn't realize the money had not been spent yet for some reason. It was
Wild
news to me.
Turkey is new to me too. When did they enter the scene, and did I just?
Wild Turkey Divide is the corporate name of the entity that is
Dirt Capital?
Dirt Capital. Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's the same company.
It's essentially the same company. There's a small component that Bread and Butter has in it, but it is effectively Dirt Capital, just a new LLC out of that, which has been the principal owner for a few years now. That's not new. It's just a different name for the same group.
Okay. Paul, I'm looking at. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Andrew.
No, just because I'm not that familiar with the history. So the 600 and the 300 that we were just referring to, has it though been set aside, or is that going to come out of future open space funds? Like, do we already have it available to spend, or are we looking, to take it out of future open space revenue?
Martha, can you answer that?
Well, where in the finance drive is it, Martha? I think it's in your accounting. I think it's accounted for within our tracking of the open space.
That's correct.
So it's in the open space fund. Is that right?
Who's talking?
Who is speaking? Oh, maybe it's just kids.
I don't think. Hi, I don't think I got your question fully.
So the question is that in the open space fund tracking for property acquisition, we've been accounting for the money to purchase the Eau Claire property or to fund the Eau Claire property conservation.
I don't think the open space for the land acquisition is assigned to a specific property. But yes, we have been accumulating, and we are tracking that amount.
So we have that amount,
We have the amount.
which is what your
Okay.
question was. We're not just
Yeah, so
tracking it, we got it in the bank somewhere.
And
It's already there, and we're not using future funds to fund this. It's already there.
correct.
Good,
And I
okay.
think when we've been discussing with the council at any point about what your balance is, it is assuming that this has been spent.
So it's not available for anything else unless.
Because the
it's-
council's already voted to spend it, so it's put in the, is that correct?
Yes, it's being tracked.
2017.
Right.
We still have the money, but yes, it's being tracked and that it is assigned to this for this project.
Paul, when I look at the map, that little most northernly nub that sort of is half of the old barn that's fallen down. And it says future farm hub for bread and butter. Is that where the USDA was talking about potentially having farm housing built?
That's correct. So the part that the lower part of it, and this is a rough map, but the lower part of it is the conservation area,
Mhm.
and the northern portion of it that looks a little bit like a sports finger, foam finger, is that's the excluded portion. So that would be potentially for a farm hub, potentially for farm worker housing, and if ever the entities Wild Turkey Divide or anyone else goes to sell it for a purpose that is not consistent with that, that's where the city has a right of first refusal.
Okay.
So that's the portion that you would have the right of first refusal on. The remainder is anticipated in the coming weeks to be permanently conserved.
And these parcels haven't yet been subdivided, is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
So this is still all one property, including property perhaps north of the 13 acres?
The portion north of the 13 acres was subdivided at the several years ago.
Okay, that's separate then.
But the two yellow portions are one property.
Mhm.
This agreement that you're looking at tonight talks about a division to allow for two different owners of this yellow area.
Okay.
But it would not be a formal subdivision. Any development in the future of any way, shape, or kind on either of those would require DRB review as a subdivision.
And so when I was walking this weekend, the field that's west of that is part of the cider mill 3, correct? I mean, it looks like they're putting a road in, so I assume.
Yes. So
Okay.
it,
And
where
so
my
that's
hand
where
is here,
potentially water and sewer could get to the farm housing.
that's correct. So this where my hand is showing on the screen there, that is Cider Mill 2 / now they call it Edgewood.
Oh, right.
And then over further to the left here on this light brown, that's the city-owned Scott property here.
Mm-hmm.
And to the south of that is the permanently conserved Leduc properties / bread and butter. And then very most recently, just last year, Sarah donated a permanent conservation easement to her property right here. So these are all coming together as being a large contiguous area of conservation.
Okay, thank you.
I have another question.
Yes.
So is a survey required for this at all?
Not at this point.
Not at this point. So both parties would, I mean, they're agreeing on an imaginary line, but it's a well-established imaginary line, so they understand it?
The way it's worded is we've required that once it's divided, we're not going to approve or allow future waivers of development or land development regulation requirements. So it has to be a line. My understanding would be it would be a line that essentially they choose, but it has to be well thought out, and there has to be a background and a reasons for why they choose that line. But as it's not, it's not officially recognized by the city as a division until subdivision review occurs.
Okay.
It's up to them at this point to make that division.
Is there any risk that this imaginary line could move like substantially, north or south and expand one area? I mean, are the two acreages pretty much?
Can I interrupt that Britt Hazelton from the Vermont Land Trust is on the video call? If you'd like to have him answer this question, I think he can for you.
Oh, okay.
Convenient.
So,
Hi there. Can everyone hear me?
yes, very well. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thanks for having this discussion. So the parcel B, which is comprised of the 104 acres to be conserved and the 13.41 acres that the exclusion future farm hub, those are already surveyed. We have a survey plat depicting both with the dividing line. We designed that exclusion, that 13.41, to hopefully accommodate, a future farm related development plan that meets the LDRs. But no one's in a position to actually go through with that entire planning process at this point. But the boundaries are set. They can't change. We have a survey. We're going to have as Paul mentioned, an NRCS and Vermont Housing and Conservation Board funded easement along with the city funds that can't really be changed. So the 13.41 acre exclusion, those lines are defined and won't be changed in the future.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
And maybe, could I just quickly, yeah, this agreement's really a great outcome. It'll allow, as Paul said, Vermont Land Trust to purchase the 104 acres after it's conserved and hold on to it and, at a very low cost of capital. And then the ultimate goal is we are helping establish, along with some farm businesses and local folks, a new nonprofit called the AgriHood Collective. And ultimately that new nonprofit will be the long-term owner of these pieces. And so, perhaps at a future date, we can come back and discuss that. But it's all very exciting.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we ready? You have a question? Sure. Would you come up to the mic, please? Jimmy. Yeah,
It's on though.
push the button in the middle where it says push.
Yeah, it is green. Okay, here we go. Okay. All right. I'm going to try not to rant. I've never been a fan of this deal. And I know a lot of other people who were not a fan of it when this property, when the city entered into this agreement. We invested over $900,000 of our city's money, our taxpayer money. And what are we getting out of this? More conserved land. This property, the zoning previously could have allowed hundreds of housing units. on this property. And people talk about the proximity of water and sewer. Well, we know that water and sewer is not that far away. Now, there's some extraordinary cost to take care of the water. I'm mindful of this kind of stuff, but we spent over $900,000 of the city's money, and in exchange, we have secured permission to use the property for some walking trails. The object of this deal, according to most of the literature that's out there, was for conservation, and much of that purpose to be directed for agricultural use. Well, the literature that was published when this property was offered for sale, whether it was the state's soil map or other literature that came from, I forget what reputable source, but it basically indicated that this property was not good agricultural property. It was not really suitable for agricultural purposes. But we went out, we saw the value in this property to invest over $900,000 of the city's money so that we could have permission to walk on a part of it. And I just want to assert for the record, in my opinion, the city spent that money so that this property would not be developed. That is what the city's goal and objective was. And they've succeeded in doing that. I would also like to just kind of offer a thought of the all or nothing approach that we seem to take with regard to real estate when we've identified property being suitable for conservation purposes. It's like, conserve it, we don't want to see a house on it. Let's forget about it. The 200-acre parcel on the east side of the road that has already been acquired, could you have spotted 2 or 3 or a handful of housing sites on that property and still maintain the integrity of that property as a conserved parcel? I say, yeah, of course you could have. And in this location, those parcels in today's economic value would probably have $300,000 a pop for those building lots. What could the city do with $1.5 million? What could the open space fund do with an extra $1.5 million? Well, I know what they could do. They could acquire the Long property. And they could go out and acquire the Long property and entertain the idea of putting a handful of houses on a property that could accommodate dozens of home sites. Why are we again heading in a direction where it's like an all or nothing exercise when the majority of the Long property will never be used for development? It can't. But we should be leveraging our city's resources when we take a look at a transaction where we're going to be acquiring property. And if we can achieve 2 objectives, objectives being to create some housing and to conserve property, that's important, and at the same time be getting the lion's share of our money back out of a transaction that can be used over and over and over again. The concept of leverage, I'm sure everybody understands what it is. Why wasn't it employed when we got involved with the Eau Claire property? Why won't it be employed with the Long property? In any event, I just wanted to make sure that somebody refreshed the public a little bit on what occurred when this transaction for the Eau Claire property went down. And I hope that we can employ a little more common sense with how we approach the use of the Long property. Thank you.
Mike, can I suggest that you stay for the next hour presentation? Because I think there's, we'll be understanding some of the consequences of the amount of population growth and housing growth that's occurred in this community. I think it would be really helpful for you to put that into the mix of let's build a whole bunch more houses.
Well, I don't think the next hour, staying here for the next hour, is going to provide me with knowledge that I might possess already. Okay, I'm pretty familiar with what happens when there's a population increase, and there's no free lunch.
Well, I don't think you understand what's before the city in terms of the CLA and Act 140,
127.
127.
Well, it's been getting a lot of publicity, and I know we're confronting some
Well,
pretty.
we're going to hear about it in terms of
Yeah.
its direct impact to our community. So you may know it all, and
Oh, come
kudos
on
to you.
now,
I'm
Helen.
just
That's an
suggesting.
uncalled for remark. You know, I may only sound like I know it all, but I don't.
Good.
You know, so I apologize if I sound that way sometimes.
Well, I'm just
Okay.
encouraging you to maybe
I think you get my point.
listen to this because it may help you understand what we'll be dealing with.
I just wanted to remind the public that the parcels that we were just discussing with our city planner and city attorney, that they are part of the Shelburne Pond wildlife corridor, which is really seen as one of the most important wildlife corridors. And we need to ensure that we live amongst and with our natural environment. We just need to. And it's also a place where there is a working farm. And we also are, I think, rightly concerned with having a broad portfolio where we have places where people can live and places where we can grow food, in addition to the wildlife corridors and our commercial and our energy regeneration and all the other things that we do in the city. So there's a place, I think, in this city where this made sense to me, and there was no ulterior motive than that in my mind.
Can I say one thing too?
Sure.
I just want to remind Mr. Simoneau that the logs came forward with a plan during interim zoning that was rejected by city council because of the principles of interim zoning. And then they turned around and they sold the property to another entity. The city does not own that entity. And if the city chooses to go into contract with them and actually build some housing, it's going to be in a negotiation that has to come to the agreement with the seller. So if there's housing built, there are going to be constraints on that, and it's not going to be sold at willy-nilly market for whatever's buildable, probably, right? So my point is that we well, I'm just saying that in the pursuit of preservation of open space, for which the voters voted to fund the open space fund, for which these lands are mostly open space, Eau Claire and right now Long, except for a couple of houses, one that's dilapidated and one that's habitable, right? That's what the principle is to try to preserve open space. And then you go back to the whole interim zoning event and all the actions that came out of that, right? Where we placed great value on, habitat blocks, forest blocks, wildlife corridors, all that stuff, right? This is right in line with all the things that we've talked about for the last 4 years, pre-pandemic. So, but I understand your angst, but this is what the voters said when they agreed to fund the open space fund originally. Yes, it is probably taking away some prime developable property for, $800,000 homes or whatever you decide to put there. But that's the point. That was the point of the open space fund.
It doesn't say the city will acquire all of the open space.
We're not trying to acquire all the open space.
Have done that.
There's still, Edgewood is being built now. Hill Farm is going to be built. There are other areas that they're going to break ground on. There are probably going to be LDR changes to enable other types of housing. So the question is, where will that be, and how quickly will the city grow? And then what's the impact going to be on these two representatives here?
Okay, so we need to take action on this, correct?
Yes.
we have to approve this? Is it a simple motion? I don't see a motion in the,
Seems like I'll move that we approve the non-development agreement and city right of first refusal for the area excluded from conservation on parcel B of the former Eau Claire farm property in line with the prior city council decision to release pre-approved funds on condition of city council approval of NDA and ROFR.
Second.
okay, is there any further discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 It's unanimous. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been a long haul and we're still not really quite done, are we? Good. Okay, thank you. We'll move on to, I'm sorry.
Break.
Okay, we'll take a 5-minute break.
I have to unplug my car before I get charged $1. Actually, it's not fully charged yet.
COD, which is the coefficient of disbursement, which takes all of those sales and plots them on a standard deviation graph, and then looks at what are outside of the regular standard deviation. And so our coefficient of dispersion is 13 this year, down from 10 or up from 10 last year, which means it's getting a little farther away, but a reappraisal actually isn't ordered until that gets to 20. So yes, we can see that spread across sales as well. So the actual hard number of sales doesn't matter, but that spread across sales matters.
So a town that has virtually, a handful of new houses built or condos and has sales is impacted similarly to a community like South Burlington, which has built a lot of condos and homes and has had a lot of sales.
Right. The number of sales doesn't matter. It's the sales against the assessed value. And it's also the new construction also doesn't really matter, because when the new construction happens, it's assessed at a new property value. So O'Brien Farm builds a new house, we assess it at completion, we know how much it costs. They then sell the house, and that ratio is the CLA ratio.
Right.
It's not that we're assessing new house to vacant land.
But in 3 years, if that house sells again, right,
Yeah.
that's when it sells for a much higher price than the CLA
Right.
starts to
So
go
then
down.
it's a
And I think that's happened.
but
I
that
mean-
still reflects the attractiveness of this community.
I
not the
understand
new
that. That's yes, but that's driving it. And if we can't afford the schools, then at some point those values will probably go down, or people won't be competing to move into South Burlington for their excellent schools.
So
They'll be running away because of the high taxes.
I want to add a historical point that the CLA, when you get an appraisal, generally speaking, over time, the closer you are to the appraisal year for us in 2021, it should hover around 100. And we've had 2 years in a row where it's dropped, significantly, and we are now at 82 instead of being at 100. So when the formula was designed, it did not have this drastic impact that it has in this year. I also think that the mechanism of getting reappraised is really off the table, because there are some communities who haven't been who have needed to get an appraisal and are on a wait list for years, and we have such a shortage. So it's really a systems problem with the formula, and us chipping away at the volume equation or the appraisal really doesn't get to the fact that the way that the formula is working is not working in our favor in South Burlington. I'll also just say that I don't think that our people need homes. We have no vacancy rates in Vermont. So a lot of folks that I know who are buying houses really don't get to choose which town they're making in. They're choosing literally any house they can afford, or, any place they can rent. So there's not the same sort of free market having flexibility that we may have had a decade ago or so.
Going back to Megan's question here and looping in Larry's, we anticipate continued prosperity in South Burlington and homes selling for more and more money. And this will lead to reduced CLAs every year we get further from reappraisal. There's a critical shortage of appraisers. Some communities are a decade plus and waiting for one. So the further we get from a reappraisal, the lower the CLA, the higher the school budget. And Larry, this has been the central part of the conversation that Kate and I have been having with our legislators, and I feel really grateful for our Chittenden County legislators, who I've had a lot of communication with and discussion, through that conversation, the CLA has been a factor that's really isolated here as a lever for potential change. Act 127 is an extremely complicated formula, and it took over a year to develop, and the Agency of Education hired numerous staff members to craft it. We're not expecting any overnight shift on any of these factors for fiscal year 25. But am I hopeful that there could be a CLA cap for fiscal year 26? Absolutely. Would that have serious positive impacts on our schools and our ability to maintain programming? Yes. So, as we work together to think about a next step, and I'm going to bring this back to our conversation at the city school meeting on Friday, is, would the council and the school board like to have discussion about shared communication with our legislators to say, hey, we know that we have a booming town, so many great things happening here, excellent schools, we want to maintain that. We need assistance, and we believe one lever could be a discussion of a CLA cap. And I think that's a communication that I've shared. You all have seen my letter that I shared with legislators, and the school board will be discussing shared communication from the board as a body to be sent. I spoke with Jeff Francis this morning, executive director of the Vermont Superintendents Association, who's providing testimony tomorrow. And he, as well as our legislators, said to me, Violet, time is of the essence, right? So these conversations are happening literally. Testimony is occurring tomorrow. So the board will likely send a letter off the back of action tomorrow night. Wednesday night. I'm just skipping ahead. But so that's communication that we're going to be having. And that's part of the reason that we chose to have this conversation with you all this evening, because it is time sensitive, our ability to advocate as a team.
Have you, I noticed on the one chart you had that Chittenden County towns had numerous minuses. Maybe one town had a plus. Is there similar reactions going on in those towns?
Absolutely. And because of the mechanics of Act 127, that is impacting us all differently. The CLA has commonly crushed school districts around the state. So an estimated 90% of us have lost with the CLA modification. The CLA, if it's capped, the state will have to contend with the question, like, where does the ed funding come from, right? Like, there's only so many levers, and the CLA is currently one of them. But superintendents all over Chittenden County have been communicating about the impacts, and they're having very similar percentages. And Larry, you're referencing the CLAs that came in, which dipped dramatically in Chittenden County, where home values are increasing. So you'll be seeing from our neighbors very similar percentages to what we have here.
So you're looking for us to join you in your request for a cap to the CLA? Is that the request?
That's one potential. We'll be having our own discussion about action steps on Wednesday, and felt like bringing you the information now, since it's pretty complicated, would take a lot of time if we were to just present it at our steering committee on January 22nd. So that's our plan moving forward, is talking together as a school board, proposing an action on Wednesday, and then sharing with you, and we could discuss together as two bodies on the 22nd, or, ideally even earlier.
We could do a joint letter after your Wednesday meeting, when you come up with maybe your initial proposals to the legislature. And then I assume a lot of communities will be thinking about that and working on other proposals.
Well, our ask right now is the cap on the CLA.
Okay.
Or, more broadly, sharing concern. I understand. I do not expect anyone in this room to be an expert on the ed funding formula, and certainly I've had a lot of learning to do with the new mechanics here. but I think, in general, this is me coming to you saying this is a crisis. And I do think the city council speaking to a level of concern would be very meaningful to the legislators. And even if you don't suggest a CLA cap, if that's, not something you're comfortable, I think begging the question of examining the education funding formula and sharing the impact on our community is appropriate. And I don't feel like that would be, overstepping as far as a suggestion. But again, making clear the impact to our community and asking for another look at this is something that would I think be really important in making any kind of change. And just passing on the timeline. This is the week where those discussions are happening and decisions are being made. So the legislator I spoke to this morning, representing the 5 legislators who met on Saturday, after my communication with them, said, Violet, if there's going to be advocacy, it needs to be this week. So just passing that along.
What form of advocacy could we take?
For me, it was a letter for 2 bodies. You could choose to reach out to legislators on your own, or as one body, as 2 bodies. It could be oral communication, whatever you all feel comfortable doing. But I want to make sure that that is a really important next step for us, one that we're taking. And I also have to really just shout out to our legislators who've been incredibly supportive and have committed a significant amount of time to understanding what information I've shared with them and to really thinking about how to work together to make changes. So I'm really appreciative of that partnership and am feeling encouraged that we can make some changes through working together.
Well, I think it would be important to have the council unanimously support your efforts and essentially the letter that you sent them. We could just co-sign if you want. I mean, I'm certainly not an expert, so I'm not going to say, well, I'm not really sure about the cap on the CLA. If that's what you think could be one step, I'm in. And so I don't know how other people feel. Megan has said she supported it. Andrew, you've been
trying to jump in. So I certainly support that letter. I do have a question though.
Okay.
And first, thank you, Violet and Kate, for this presentation. I can't imagine how stressful it is dealing with these changes that seem to have been forced upon us. So thank you. It's just really a mechanical question. Violet, you mentioned that for the budget this year, it doesn't really matter whether we spend 64 million on the low end or 71 on the high end because of the 5% cap. But I'm confused how it works when we get to 2030. When we get to 2030, does it matter what we spent this year? Is there a catch up, or does it only matter what we spend in 2030?
Yeah, great question, and thank you. So there is no catch up. It doesn't matter what we spend this year. So we've heard from a lot of folks. So some folks are saying cut back to 64 million. Others have said, mostly those in the school community, go to the 71.3.
That's where I was going. Like, does it make sense then to kind of go to the 71 and harbor your resources in effect? And,
so
because if it doesn't matter, like there's no catch up in 2030 and you just have to deal with what your level is then, why wouldn't we go to the 71 this year?
Yeah, good question. So another number of factors here. One, districts like ours who are on the giver end of this could quite literally, if we took that approach, bankrupt the yield. So because the money has to come from somewhere. So that was one factor. And we have to think about what are we committing ourselves to year in and year out. So if we were to increase staff, then we're committing to staff for every year going forward. So, the idea of bringing on new staff in this budget and not paring down in any way would in fact be inflating
I
our
wasn't
budget.
thinking that. Sure, no, I wasn't thinking that, but could you bank it, increase capital reserve, is there a way to use
Pay
the
off
money?
the ZEMS faster.
There's
Yeah,
definitely
exactly.
this is brand new legislation. This is the first year it's rolling out, so there's a ton of unknowns. But by design, it is exponentially harder to increase our budget at fiscal year 30 and beyond, which is particularly terrible timing for South Burlington because we can't even entertain a conversation about renovations or new schools or places to put the kids that are coming with the development because we have no because the impact of any increased budget after this 5% cap goes away is going to be completely unattainable. I mean, then that 20% tax rate that we're looking at with a budget that doesn't include any renovations or any real substantial increases of any kind, we would be looking at that as a regular, without any protections, 28% tax rate increase. So the outlook is not good.
So it's not feasible to pay off some things ahead of time with a larger budget until you hit 30 so that, if your debt load is gone away, that would be a saving that would not require, cutting people. I mean, I agree with Andrew. If we merrily go on to 71 million and hire, I don't know, however many people you could, that's a problem. Because unless you're just counting on, we're just going to hire you for 5 years and then those programs are going to be cut. But are there ways to pay for things ahead of time that would generate savings in the future? I don't know your budget well enough. What is your payment on the ZEMS, $1 million a year? And I can't remember.
So the ZEMS is a $6 million bond. So we are in fiscal year 25 going to be paying the first principal and interest payments on that. We are though receiving the offsetting revenue, which increases the budget via impact fees, which are estimated to pay for 91% of the ZEMS of that 6 million. So that's not. I do really appreciate the logic behind that suggestion, but any revenues that we have coming in increase expenditures, right? So they're offset in the ed funding formula. But when we discussed strategy with the board, and other districts have done this as well, the general feeling statewide and certainly with the guidance from our school board has not been to max out up to that 9.99% net ed spending. And if that's exceeded, there's a board a review to determine whether a school district's spending was irresponsible or not.
There are one-time sort of funds that I think go to the spirit of what you're naming. There was a safety audit done. We have pretty outdated intercom systems, a lot of gaps in where there could be security cameras, and one-time investments that we could make that are included in the budget, which does identify some of the spirit of what you're getting at. But I do think that the board is also trying to be sensitive to having a budget that the community will support.
Mm-hmm.
Could I ask about Act 127? Are there?
It's okay. Go ahead. Please go ahead.
Oh, I don't mean to jump in, but you do that all the time. It's been on my mind
Hurry
for a bit.
and then Tim.
Thank you.
Haven't been.
May I raise?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
The educators are here.
Make sure.
Yes, right.
So Act 127 and the changes, is there reactions to that need legislative assistance as well?
Yeah, certainly. And I think this is where Chittenden County is more split. I spoke to the superintendent and his business manager in Burlington this morning. They're not advocating for changes to the Act 127 formula because they're on the receiving end. Right. So districts like Colchester, Essex Westford, Milton, Montpelier, Roxbury, Winooski, we are all on CVSD. We're all on the giving side of that. Right. So Act 127 is impacting every district really differently. For us, negative financial impact. And the CLA is the common source of pain on top of Act 127, changes in the what used to be the equalized pupil is now long-term weighting. So yes, modifications to Act 127 would benefit our community very much. And I want to just be clear. I mean, the board, the district, and I certainly support increased quality of education statewide, and I very much believe in what the essence of Act 127 is trying to do, which is trying to increase equity statewide, which I believe supports our community and all communities. However, without modification, it'll have a crippling effect on ours if CLAs continue to drop.
But you also said that that's probably a really trickier and longer term process to get that change. So perhaps it could get a push, but this is a longer term process too. All the communities that you cited, particularly at least in Chittenden County, where you probably really know them, organizing in some way to make that case, and actually divvying up the Senate probably helps us, because it was 6 from Chittenden County, and Burlington often held sway. But
That's
that isn't the
exactly.
case anymore. So that's sort of a longer term process, but although you need to sort of get her done
Yeah, and that's
sooner,
exactly what
but
we've done is superintendents are reaching out to legislators in all of our
yeah.
respective areas, and school boards are doing the same. VASBO, the financial organization of business officials, is organizing. The Vermont School Board Association is organizing, and the Vermont Superintendents Association. So there's a lot of advocacy, and some of our legislators are getting mixed messages. Right, so someone who received a letter from me will also likely receive one from Burlington. And my letter says Act 127 is impacting us in addition to CLA. Tom calls me and says, I can't join on the Act 127 component. However, I'm with you in the CLA. So most of the other districts in Chittenden County are experiencing what we are with Act 127 as well. So advocacy is certainly important, and there's a lot of it happening. Kate Kate and I have just reviewed a draft that she prepared, which is something that she'll bring to the school board on Wednesday night for consideration. Perhaps the next step is that she share that with Helen and Jesse, and maybe for distribution to you all. Should that be something that you all want to modify or add on to, or would be willing to send? I think the combination would be powerful if it was letter from me, letter from school board, and then the joint letter school board, city council, and Jesse and I could sign that as well. I think would be really powerful. And all of these letters focus on this factual information. When I was, we've done a lot of advocacy so far as regional groups. But I got the specific feedback from legislators saying, wow, this letter was really impactful because you put specific figures and we could not have imagined the impact without them. And I had that same visceral response when I received the CLA, right?
Mhm.
Just total shock and devastation was my reaction. And, now moving to a point where it's important we have to communicate and advocate about this. So, again, I appreciate the opportunity for that conversation to occur tonight and to share with those in the community. It's a lot of information to convey, and it's dense, and it's really hard news to share.
So,
Tim,
so now,
now, yes.
so this forum is an excellent place to disseminate the information that you've brought tonight. I'm hoping that the other paper, if they're online, is listening very closely to all the facts and details so that they can publish a very accurate portrayal of the budget crisis that the school system in South Burlington and other Chittenden County schools are facing right now because of the witch's brew stirred up by Montpelier with their Changes Act 27. That being said, why don't we make a change to our property assessment laws where when a house is sold for more than it's assessed at, it snaps up to the value of the sale? Is that legal? So that all future sales, the CLA would be one. You buy a house for $20,000 more, you pay your assessed value is now that sale. Because new construction, every assessed value of new construction is equal to the value that it was sold at. So why aren't homes, when they're sold at a much larger percentage of price, why doesn't the assessed value snap up to the sale price? I'm just asking that question. I don't know the answer, but I know that I've heard that in Florida there was a similar case where seniors in their homes felt like their property assessments were going up too quickly. So if you'd been in your home more than 20 years, then it could not exceed a property appraisal increase of more than 3% or something like that. It was like you'd been there for so long, you're going to be there for a lot longer, and you shouldn't be overcharged property appraisal when there was more appraisal going. The other properties were going up faster, right? This is kind of the opposite of that, where you say that, hey, well, what's the fair assessed value of a home? It's whatever the sale price is, period. And so when you go to sell your house, if your house is now worth another $100,000, right, then that's what the sale price will be for the appraisal price. I don't know.
Make tax abatement easier.
Yeah.
I certainly think the fact that there's no real incentive in this formula for new construction is a flaw, and I think generally from a statewide legislative perspective, South Burlington's doing a lot of things right. Like we are trying to address the housing crisis. We are trying to be developing and being climate conscious, and yet there's very little incentive built into what we're seeing here for us. It feels like we're only getting the stick and not the carrot. So, but we on the school side of things don't have any expertise in how all of these different property taxes play out and property sales. And so that could be another conversation that we have, or perhaps you have with the legislators who are on those committees to think through ways that the good work that we're doing in South Burlington could play out to our benefit in our education funding model.
So I think Tim, you hit something, because I was thinking not along those lines, because that's a brilliant thought. But the CLA, wherever the basis of the CLA is, did not take into account this situation where there's a housing crisis. And so there might be a fix there. I don't know, but something has to be reflected in that. It might have been an unintended consequence of some far-reaching thought about statewide property tax. In other but it's not just here in Chittenden County where people are experiencing. The people who are selling their homes are moving away, so they're not benefiting. They're cashing out, and they're not going to be affected by the new tax rate that the new owners have to pay. So there's something in this situation that's acting against the intention of the legislation, because it's forcing property taxes to take on much more of a burden than they should.
Right.
Yeah. But
Jesse,
I think that's a great idea, Tim.
You wanted to respond
So
or say something?
several comments. it's illegal under state statute right now to do what you're suggesting, but there is another bill in front of the legislature that started last session that's continuing on, looking at the statewide assessment system writ large. Does it stay with municipalities? Does it go to the state? We have a statewide education grand list. Should properties be assessed at the state level? Should they be assessed locally? That's a hugely divisive topic at the VLCT table. There's a conversation about doing assessments regionally, so requiring reassessments every 6 years, blah, blah, blah. So this might actually be a really good time to add for South Burlington to advocate for a relook at that appraisal system or assessment system. I do think it's also an interesting question. The reason it's illegal now is that the CLA has historically been used in the education funding formula as the way to equalize property values across communities in Vermont. Now that is not being taken into consideration in terms of ordering reappraisals, it does seem to be a mismatch in the system. I think that's a real good argument for the CLA cap or getting the CLA out of the education funding formula altogether, is it's not being used to require reappraisals. Can I switch topics for just a minute while I have the open mic?
Yes, and then I think Andrew, you want to ask a question, but let Jesse.
I was just going to second Tim's comment. I think it's brilliant, and I think we should push for legislative change to allow us to do that.
So, yeah, happy to. I mean, maybe we would work on a paragraph in the letter saying something, reflecting that. I do. And I haven't seen your letter yet, so forgive me if I'm overstepping into something you all have already written. I do think putting up front and center in that letter that we support equity, as you have very articulately said, Violet, is really important. I also think one of our huge challenges right now in this week conversation is that we don't have good data on how these state level policy decisions are impacting communities on either the Act 127 basis or the CLA basis. And I think part of our advocacy should be not only changing CLA, changing appraisal rates, redoing the funding formula, but also having the state be transparent about what the impacts of 127 are on each community and what the impacts of the CLA are on each community. Mm-hmm. I think if we understood that better, we as Vermonters understood that better, how those levers were pulling against one another, we may come up with different kinds of solutions. But we're trying to come up with solutions that are based solely on us, not seeing how those solutions are spread over the state. And very unpopular position at the State House, to have these huge impacts on Chittenden County communities that are the economic engine of the state. If we start having those impacts continue from now until FY30 and beyond and erode that economic engine and the vibrancy of our communities, that's going to have a much larger impact on the statewide. Mm-hmm. And I think so that, to me, that's why we really need to understand how these, like, community-wide, what the impact is, not just on us. So I think putting a request in the letter also for that kind of transparency on both sides would be super helpful.
I wonder if, so Jesse, you have just brought forward a number of points that I'm now wondering, does the school board send a letter and the draft go to you all, and then from that you add those pieces and it's a separate communication with your vantage points? I think knowing the different audiences and the different interests represented almost would make it more effective if there were two different letters. Knowing how good Kate is, I imagine she already shared it with Jesse and Helen, but that might be a better next step given what you've just shared could be added to the communication.
I guess I sort of disagree. I think a joint letter, and it can be as simple or as complicated as what the school board comes up with the council saying, we are right behind you. We agree with what they're saying. This is a crisis. I think then we can write our own letter from a municipal perspective, here are some things that you know, you might want to think about or change or do to help solve this. I guess,
That
I don't
sounds
know.
great to us.
People disagree, that's fine. We can do two separate letters if you want.
No, I think that saying we're right behind you, I think that's a nice, yeah.
Yeah, we would be very grateful for that messaging.
Because you'll have to write it.
Well, I'm thinking on the fly here.
Well, so
I
am
think, you know, that I'm coming back to the timeliness and how specific can we get in our ask to the legislature with the information we know right now this week. And we can't. I mean, the reality is, I don't know what the municipal arguments are to fix this for South Burlington this week. So part of me almost thinks that we need the joint letter now that's high level, values based. This is having a huge impact. We believe in equity. We need data. We need you to make structural change to the CLA and the ed funding formula. And then as more conversation happens at the legislature, then maybe we start sending our own more detailed policy statements saying, here are some ideas about how you could do that. But I almost think the values-based commentary now with what we know should be joint. I think it's more powerful joint.
That's what I think.
Yeah, I agree.
That sounds like a great next step, and
I agree.
And we, you know, really appreciate that communication. I think, you know, I can go to bed tonight thinking we've done right by our community, which is a small victory in a string of really, really difficult acknowledgments and difficult conversations. So I appreciate the partnership from this team and the opportunity to discuss this candidly and for us to work together. And I will leave here hopeful and you know, standing by on how we can get these letters sent out. So happy to take any more questions or comments, but really wanted to pass that gratitude along. So thank you.
Yeah. I think I'll do is if there are a number of people are online, and I will just ask them or tell them if anyone wants to make a comment, please turn your picture on, or at least your microphone, and just I'd ask that people make them kind of brief because we're running a little bit later than I had thought, but this is a really important conversation, the first of what I hope will be several. So is there anyone online who wants to say anything?
No one's indicated that they want to talk. Elizabeth Fitzgerald says, excellent discussion on joint communication and potential solutions to CLA Act 125 and ed funding issues.
Okay. Well, then I guess we'll leave it for now. We've got lots more to do, and I would encourage the other paper or Vermont Digger to dig deep and really have some good conversations with you, Violet, and Kate to really understand this, because I think it's pretty complex, and it's one of those things where it's pretty easy to say, oh, look at all these percentages and kind of miss some of the important concepts behind this. So I would encourage our listeners to do that too. Okay.
Could I just one last?
Yes, you may.
So getting back to that disparity between the low and the high amount in terms of the same, that's a really hard thing to convey to people.
Yes. Yeah, I don't understand
Did me saying it 6 times this evening help support that? Open to feedback on how to communicate that effectively.
Right, exactly. I don't know how you do that, but because it's the obvious thing is, well, go for the money if that's what we're going to need. But there's mitigating things not to do that. So communicate. So I mean, that's a hard thing to convey to folks.
Well, I don't quite understand why. That I mean, that's to me is the largest question. Is like you can cut the budget $9 million and it does nothing. That doesn't make sense.
Well, cutting it $9 million would get us to below a 10% homestead tax increase. That was just the example there. But if we cut it, we'd have to cut it more than 4.4 million
I'm
to
sorry.
have any
Okay.
reduction below 18.27% increase. And it's really difficult to understand that. Tim Jarvis, our Senior Director of Finance and Ops, who's on the call, we spent a lot of time discussing all of the ins and outs in this, and it's something that is extremely complicated. So boiling it down to some quick facts is something that our team is working on, of just how to make this information easily understandable to the average community member.
I mean, the material the material you've already provided is excellent, and I could see it on a big page of people. But it causes a lot of questions. It's like, why don't we go for this? And if we're raising this much money, because it's going somewhere else. So,
right. One other piece that I think is we're not explicitly saying is that generally, if a budget is voted down and there are spending cuts made, then your tax rate goes down. But what we're presenting is a scenario where the budget could not pass and we could make dramatic cuts and the tax rate would stay exactly the same.
right. Exactly.
And that's really hard for schools and for our students and for us as taxpayers.
Oh, yeah. That's a tough decision for a voter. I mean, I'm kind of like, so we've got to support it and then try to look at some longer term.
Well, let's go with that. Thank you. Thank you for having us. We really appreciate
Sooner
it.
term solutions. But thank you very much. And
Thank you both.
Thank you.
your conversations make ours seem like not too hard. Good.
That this is not sustainable.
Andrew, did you have a final comment or just?
No, I just want to say thank you to Viola and Kate for a wonderful presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both.
So is there any other business? Seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And goodbye.
Thank you,
Good night.
Andrew, for tuning in.
Thank you, Helen.
Now go have dinner.
Important discussion.